Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this meeting of the Standards Committee. My name's Councillor Churchill, and I'm the Vice Chair of the committee. Councillor Proctor, unfortunately, is unable to make it this evening. I think the register's been sent round. Yeah. And it's been a while since we've all met, so it might be worth us going around and introducing ourselves at this stage.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jane Lefebvre. I'm Corporate Director for Governance and Community Strategy, and I'm the Council's Monitoring Officer.
Alex Murray, Governance Officer.
My name is Patrick Myers. I'm the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Group and a member for Hell Barnes.
Councillor Linda Blackburn, Councillor in Davyhulme East.
Clive Griffiths, Independent Co-opted Member.
I'm Geraldine Coggins. I'm Councillor for Altrincham and Leader of the Green Party Group.
I'm Ben Hartley, Councillor for Ashton on Mersey Ward.
David Goodman, Independent Co-optee.
Lawrence Walsh, Councillor for Gorse Hill Ward.
Denise Weston, Councillor for Broadheath Ward.
Richard Brown, Independent Co-optee.
Thank you. So the next, so in terms of apologies, are there any apologies apart from Councillor Proctor?
We've also received apologies from Councillor Jarman.
Okay, so the next item is the minutes. Are the minutes of the previous meeting agreed?
Let's raise a couple of points. Item 6, the end of the first paragraph, it mentions about emails being shown to members. Did that take place? Because they didn't come to independent members. No.
Yes, I circulated it to the email to all Trafford councillors. I forgot to include the independent members. I'll send that around after the meeting.
No, that's fine. That's fine. That actually raised something else in my mind when I was looking at the minutes. Just briefly, item 8. You're using the terms councillor and member interchangeably, and sometimes it becomes a bit confusing whether it means member of this committee or a member of council. I just think it could be thought through, I think.
So subject to those amendments, are the minutes agreed? Okay, so we go on to the next item, which is the Trafford response to the local government ethical standards areas of best practice. So this is something that has been to the committee previously, and we agreed to implement the recommendations in principle. I'll pass you over now to Jane, who will take you through the report.
Thank you. Yes, you've got a fairly full report here, which sort of picks up on all the items. As say, it had previously been to the committee, and we'd agreed in principle that we'd adopt all the recommendations in the Committee of Standards in Public Life report, their review. But what we hadn't got was an action plan as to how we actually put them into place. So what we've been doing is looking at what needs to be done, because some require changes effectively to the Code of Conduct, which are constitutional changes. Some require changes to our provisions around gifts and hospitality, some to the members' complaints procedure, etc. And some obviously incorporate changes which will affect the way in which we interact with parish councils and the support that is given to the parish councils. So what we thought would be useful would be that we set out a plan which detailed each of the recommendations. It sets them out in full, and the purpose of this is so that you can see this, but also so that you can be involved in the changes as they're made. Particularly those where there will be a change to either the code of conduct or the procedure, because those will of necessity involve changes to the constitution, which the Standards Committee have to approve. So it was felt that we'd set out a timetable which would ensure that we met the original expectations, which would be that we would have these in place by June, July of this year. So this plan enables us to meet all of those. So I thought it would be useful. If you want us, we can quickly run through the various steps that are required. So you've got, in terms of these recommendations, you've got, in the first column, you've got what the item of best practice is, the area that's affected. Then in second column, action required, the various actions in more detail, the deadline, and then also it assigns an officer that's responsible for taking these through, which or obviously if it's a team. So in respect to the first three, they sort of come together, as it were. 1 and 2 involve changes to the code of conduct, which one relates to bullying and harassment, and the other relates to an attempt to give slightly more teeth to the Standards Committee, in that it requires that members are obliged to comply with standards investigations, and also an attempt to screen out trivial or malicious allegations, which, say, fortunately is not something we experience in the way that some other councils do. So because those both involve a change to the code of conduct, the action there is to update the code of conduct, which will be done by the 25th of February. 3 requires that we also take on board a review, an annual review of the code of conduct. So what we've done is we've wrapped the two of them together. So we will be reviewing the code we'll amend the code of conduct, and then it also gives us an opportunity for us to review it as a whole. And in order to do that, we would bring the updated code back to this committee prior to it then being consulted on with the parish councils, community organisations, and also to take a view on neighbouring councils, their particular codes of conduct. So it will then provide for us to consult, which is what is recommended in the best practice. If we do review the constitution, that the code of conduct, that we consult with others on it, and then it'll come back here for final sign-off before going back to council. Yeah.
Could I just ask, would neighbouring authorities' code of conduct have any impacts on our own?
I think that's simply in there, but to give us a benchmark, because again, there's no standard. There are recommended forms, but it enables us to see what other authorities do. And I think it would be useful, if we're consulting on this, that there may be some options that we might want to follow. So it's really just to look in terms of best practice, that as part of our review, we do consider what other authorities are doing to see whether or not there is anything that we can learn from that or benefit from that. And it will then inform the review and the consultation. So it's there on that purpose, not on the basis that they would have a say. It's really so that it helps us to inform our own review.
Okay. Sorry, Jen, just while you stop for that question, could I just ask about best practice 2 and requiring councillors to comply with any formal standards investigation? Have you an idea yet as to how that would work, how that would be enforced? So if a councillor didn't comply, would that amount to a further allegation in itself, or?
I mean, it may well constitute a breach in itself of the code because you're failing to comply. So it compounds the potential offence. But there are some authorities now look at imposing certain sanctions in that respect. So whether you could look at withdrawing certain benefits that apply, so sort of access to council support, various things. I mean, it's very difficult because I'm loath to go along, perform what they need to do in terms of their the people that they represent. But I think what we need to do is to perhaps look at, and this is where it is useful to look at other authorities, is to see whether there are a range of things that we could potentially use as a means to trying to secure us. Again, it's not an issue that we experienced in any great degree here, but this is best practice, and we should therefore be looking to incorporate it if it is relevant. Okay.
It's just a query with regard to the deadlines, really. One of the items, at least, that I've seen will come into effect in the next municipal year, but some of these actions will actually flow over from this municipal year to next one. Would it be possible to have the ones that are deadline for June and July of this year to be brought forward into April or May and completed in the current year, so we can start the new system off for the whole of the next municipal year? And while you're looking at it, there's a typo on, which you've probably seen, on item 12, I think it is. Someone's kept their finger on the date a bit too long. We've got 2020. Just an extra 2.
Yeah, that gives us a bit longer.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Yes, we can have a look at that. We sort of had a look at the timetable because one of the things we tried to do was to bring it into the. One of the things we'd considered was whether we brought it into the annual council meeting, where there's a raft of changes that go through, but they tend to go through without scrutiny. And that was one of the things I didn't want to do, that they just went through on the nod with all the changes that we make around different posts. And I think the other thing is that we would need to consider whether we can actually carry out a consultation and still be able to get it in. But we'll play with the timescales if you would like us to do that, and see whether or not we can bring it in. So, Alex wants to.
There is one item, the one that relates to the annual governance statement, that has a deadline of June this year, but that's because that's the council's deadline, a statutory deadline for when they have to have the AGS published and on our website in draft to go to external audit. So that deadline will stay the same, but we can see if we can bring a draft to you before.
Sorry to come back on this, but I think it'd just be much more convenient if it was all within this year, and it would make it easier for the mayor next year at that AGM.
I don't know if you're going.
Sorry, Councillor Weston, you had a point?
Yeah, my question was just following on from Councillor Hartley's question, really, the second part of that best practice too, prohibiting trivial or malicious allegations by councillors. I know sometimes, particularly during election periods, certain things are quoted or printed in the press. I know we have had issues of some rather nasty, unauthorised and unsigned stuff really being popped through people's letterboxes. Would this cover that element of things as well? It's hard to identify, isn't it?
It wouldn't cover it unless it was made the subject of a complaint to this committee, because these are things that are within the code of conduct. It would, to the extent that you could make the code of conduct specific around the fact that those allegations are not, those types of allegations are not acceptable, although to me that's implicit in any event. But we can have a look at whether or not there's something that can be done there. But I say it wouldn't, in terms of the prohibition. Largely, this is to get at situations where members make repeated allegations to the Standards Committee about other members, and that's what this is sort of aimed at, rather than allegations that are made outside in the world at large.
Councillor Coggins, you had a point.
Thank you. We still on point 2. Did you want to go through point by point, or are we good to move to point throughout?
I was going to run through them if that's... Are we happy with those first 3? Yes?
I was just on 3. I just see the deadline for that is July, whereas it said at the start we were talking about June. Is that a typo, or is it just running slightly over?
I think it's just when it would be able to when it'd be able to go to council, because it would generally be the July council, because it would go to the executive in June, but there isn't a council always in June, so we'd need to look at the timetable for that. But bearing in mind what Councillor Myers has said, we will look to see if we can bring it forward. Yeah, it's usually May and July, so that's fine. Okay. So 4 was a recommendation around the publication of the code, which we already do. 5 was around the gifts and hospitality register and around it being updated. Now, we automatically, it's picked up after each election. So what we've agreed is that for this coming municipal year, we will arrange to send out quarterly reminders to members of the need to ensure that their gifts and hospitality details are up to date, and to register, to ensure that the register generally around their interests is up to date. So that we'll combine those factors at that stage. Okay.
Still £25 for decorations.
I can't remember, that sounds awful, but I think it's gone up. I thought it was now it's gone up to 50 or 100.
Yeah, in the report that the committee did, they said best practice is £100 usually. I don't know if that's what we've accepted.
So 6 is around the is linked into the complaints procedure, and as part of that, when considering complaints, we have to apply a public interest. That we apply public interest as we consider whether or not it's in the public interest to conduct an investigation in relation to certain complaints where they're sort of relatively trivial. There's a balance that we apply. And it's not defined, and this simply says that we will develop a public interest test which we will apply when we're considering whether or not complaints are progressed through to investigation. So this again sort of looks at... Oh, that's okay, don't worry. Get through the door. Thank you. You're lucky you found us because we've moved.
I've been trying to get through there.
Sorry.
The security guys told me to come in.
Do you want to explain?
Yes, so we're just considering the third point on the agenda, and we're going through the action plan.
I mean, generally it looks at proportionality, reasonableness and balance, and then obviously we'll look at the nature of the subject matter as well and the areas that it affects. So there are a number of factors that you would generally apply. Yes, I think filtered is perhaps not what you do. It's a criteria. You will judge whether or not they reach a threshold effectively. And if they meet that threshold of the public interest test, then you will proceed with it. So perhaps that's a terminology for the plan, but not necessarily for the way in which we will apply it. But what we are proposing is that we develop some guidance, some clear guidance around how we fall to you to consider it further. So.
Can I ask, could you give us an example of something that would be filtered out?
I was just going to say, well, it's quite common on complaints procedures like this about professionals or members that you have an initial screening stage to screen out things that are clearly not relevant. Maybe I'll give an example and Jane can tell me if it's right or wrong. I guess if you're applying a public interest test, if someone sent us a complaint in about me saying Councillor Hartley has not cut the hedge in front of his house for 6 months, that would probably get screened out, I would imagine. So I'm just trying to think of something that's, a completely private matter that doesn't really relate to our role as members, but, somebody could complain by virtue of the fact we are members.
I think that perhaps, sorry, go on.
Could I? Sorry. And yet, it's a fine balance, isn't it? And I mean, this will be a tricky thing to do. This will be a fine balance because you can't use this public interest test to negate the code. And so, but equally, it's got to be sensible, and it has got to weed out things that shouldn't really be there. But it's a fine test, and I'm not sure where one draws the line. So I can imagine that will be an item of significant debate come the day we actually look at that in detail.
And I think the issue is it generally as I say, it comes in at the point where you may have had an allegation. It would have to have been something which would be a breach of the code potentially, but where you look at it and if it is a breach of the code, but it is of such a trivial nature, but that to investigate it would involve you interviewing 10 people, bringing in an independent person, the costs of doing that, the likelihood of any sanction or action being taken against the member concerned being very small. These are all very the sort of things that you would weigh in the balance, which you would say really in that instance the cost and to the public purse of conducting an investigation does not justify the likely outcome, even if the complaint is upheld. It's that sort of situation. I think that's perhaps right. Do you want to say anything on that as one of our independent persons?
Obviously, I become an arbiter in the case when it comes, and hopefully without a view in relation to individual councillors or the council setup. My view in respect of this is that it is going to be very difficult because, as you're just describing some of the issues there, they all come into play. And I'm surprised that actually the review that's been done has actually said that we've got to do this. It's done anyway, but actually putting it down on paper and coming up with something that can be judged, because it's very much, I think, about a personal view of you as the council, me as the independent person. The only thing is that there is an opportunity, I think, later on that says that we disclose at some stage what the outcomes of these are. And I think there's another test there to be made. So I think you would generally err on the side of caution there to say that it will be something that will be considered very, very carefully. I don't think it's going to be easy to put down in words how you do that. And I think as you're just trying to think of a method of putting examples out, that's very difficult because you have to weigh up all the situations that you're faced with. So I'm sorry, I can't give you any definitive from my point of view. I think it becomes one that we just have to sit down and work through.
agree entirely with that, because the other side of the coin is the bar cannot be so high that it looks like a whitewash.
If we're trying to, if I can call it trivial, if we're trying to define trivial, that's one thing. But where we're talking about cost, I think that's kind of a secondary issue. I think the benchmark's got to be reached without a cost implication. Sort of talk to it's kind of saying somebody might listen to the conversation might think, well, we're not going to investigate that because there's such a high cost of interviewing people. If there's an issue, it does need to be dealt with.
There is still a balance that is applied, and that is the same as would apply around prosecutions, these sort of things. It is, in every area where you're applying a judicial or quasi-judicial process, there is a public interest test that applies. In very few of them is it actually defined. So we will be challenged, I think, around this one. But we did feel that we should be picking up. These are clear recommendations. So we will see what we come up with at the next.
Sorry, just a quick in relation to that. I think Jane mentioned before about proportionality. There's also necessity, and the various things that come from Human Rights Act is to say that if you apply those as the beginning of the tests, you begin to look at to start with the necessity, the proportionality of it. I think you can tease out these areas, as you say. The cost should be irrelevant unless there is, if there is a necessity, but if there is no necessity and proportionality about it, then the costs probably then get pushed to one side.
Councillor Coggins.
Thank you. If this report is asking all councils to have this, surely we can copy and paste from someone that's doing it well, or the LGA might have some guidance. Surely we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Don't worry, it's something we consult on regularly. So I consult with my colleagues across Greater Manchester, and it's something we're all now working on, and we will be coming up with something pretty similar in most of them, I would imagine. Okay. So we move swiftly on. 7 is around us having at least 2 independent persons, which we do. 8 is around the members' complaints procedure and around the consultation with the independent person, which again we do. That's written into our process, and so we already meet that particular standard. 9 is, as was just mentioned, this requirement to publish the details of allegation and the view of the independent person and reasoning of decision maker and sanctions applied. So it's all around trying to promote the openness, some openness around the process, because other than the fact that they're recorded, if they come to a committee, there is no other external sort of oversight over the process. So this is around providing that openness and transparency around it. So again, what we're proposing is that we'll be drafting something up which reflects this best practice, that would be a decision notice, and that we could use in these circumstances. There are various things that we do need to consider in publishing those details. And again, it's not going to be a straightforward thing. I think it's something that I would probably consult with the independent persons before we bring something back as well, because it will involve you being more pushed more into the spotlight than you would have been. So
I have no problem with being pushed into the spotlight, but I do have concerns over either the complainant or that person complained against, and just how that is dealt with, anonymity or otherwise. I think there is some very, very careful considerations to be made there that will involve discussions backwards and forwards quite considerably before anything's published.
No, it is difficult, and it's something that I've already had some initial discussions with our information governance manager, because I think there are data protection issues there that need to apply. There are obviously issues around complaints procedures generally. It's in terms of publication of details, so it is something we need to look at very carefully. And again, it's something that we're looking at through our Chief Legal Officers group. Sorry, we move on to 10, which is around the guidance published. But sometimes we get people from time to time who don't understand it. And it is, I think, a good opportunity to review this as part and parcel of the overall procedure. So we'll bring that back with all the other changes that are being proposed. It is a bit of a clunky procedure at times, and I'm sure that we can improve that. 11. Sorry.
If the deadline is the 4th of March for item 10, and we don't have a meeting before that date, would it be done via email?
The 4th March is written in because that's the date of your meeting. So that's the date to come to you.
To consider, we can discuss it at the meeting, and then we'll implement it as soon as possible after that, if it's agreed. Okay.
Sorry, just on number 10, Ron, weren't we? Is there a variety of ways in which someone can submit a complaint? I'm just thinking about accessibility, and so I don't know what it says currently, but I would certainly favour sort of having a variety of ways in which someone could make a complaint.
Yep, at the moment they can do it through by writing a letter, or through email, or by phoning the council. They should get put through to us. But I'll I think at the moment it has on one of the web pages it has an out of date date, whereas like on another one it has the correct one. So I'll just making sure it all matches up correctly.
So number 11 is in relation to it's parish council complaints procedures, and it deals with formal complaints about the conduct of a parish councillor towards a clerk. Should be made by the chair or by the parish council as a whole, rather than by the clerk in all but exceptional circumstances. So that one and number 12 relate. Again, that also relates to parish councils and is around extending the monitoring officer's role to provide more information, advice and support to parish councils. Because remember, it was in the old code and it came out and there was no role for it. And so this is again sort of looking at assistance and support that can be made available to the parish councils, and also training. So again, I think these are two that I would wrap together, as it were, because I think in order for us to come up with something, it's not something we should be, I want to do in isolation, it's something that we should be doing with the parish councils. So we will arrange to meet with the representatives outside of this and then draw something up and bring it back in April to Standards Committee for approval. So we're giving ourselves a little bit longer to deal with that one. So.
I just wonder if we could have some clarification on number 11. So this is about a complaint about the behaviour of a councillor in their dealings with the clerk. Is that correct? And so what if it's the chair themselves? So if the chair behaves inappropriately towards the clerk, do they have to take their own case? I wasn't sure if we could just get some clarification how that works.
This is a direct lift from the guidance, and it is to deal with sort of specific sets of circumstances where there can be infighting in parish councils and issues between chairs and clerks, and it's a very common issue.
Our parish councils run really well. Everyone has respect for the clerk, and everyone knows. It's brought up at meetings about. So we don't really have that type of problem in our parish councils, but I can see it happening in others where, again, it depends on the councillors. It's she basically runs everything, and everything goes through her. And we always maintain in our parish council that, the utmost respect is for the clerk, and she sort of, yeah. So as I say, with my parish council, we've not got any problem with that, because we stipulate to new councillors that when they start, the clerk is sort of over everyone, and the chair, and the clerk are both in. They both work together really well. So we don't really, as I can only say from our parish council, we can't foresee any problems with anything there. But it would be nice, in case it did happen, to find out what procedures we do go through,
So coming back to your point, as I say, this was to deal with because as Mr. Street said, the clerks do hold quite can in parish councils hold a very unique position. I think that the concern here would be, your concern was that if the complaint is about behaviour of the chair, then I think that would probably come within the exceptional circumstances that are covered there. It is the way that I would look at that. But again, say there is quite a bit of work that we need to do around this. It does mean going back into an area that we haven't been actively involved in as a standards committee for some time, although it's largely a monitoring officer role. But we'll bring back something to you around that so you can see it. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry to labour the issue, Chair, but it feels like we're kind of precluding the clerk. The clerk can't make complaints. It's more like the parish, the chair's got to make the complaint. It seems reasonable to me if the clerk, nobody else might feel that the clerk's had a difficulty with somebody, but the clerk might certainly feel it.
No, I agree, but that's whether that comes within the exceptional circumstances. But I think it is something we need to do some work with the parish councils around to see how it would affect them. But it is sort of formal complaints about the conduct of the parish councillor towards the clerk. I mean, there is it's a very clear area that they're trying to address here. We need to work out a way that doesn't, as you say, preclude the clerk if they're the person that is risk, but gets that balance so that we don't end up with parish councils that are not able to operate effectively, which is not unknown, if I can say it that way. Okay. Yes, so those we'll be working with the parish council representatives, and we'll bring something back on that. So that will go through hopefully within this year, not 2022, whatever it was, but we will try and get those through as quickly as possible as well. 13 is around the complaints procedure and conflicts of interest, and that's already dealt with in accordance with the best practice in our process. 14 is around reports on separate bodies. And that's to deal with the fact that many councils now are setting up joint ventures, companies, community interest companies, various sort of bodies, and it's around ensuring that they also meet the same high standards of around governance and probity. And as Alex mentioned before, it's one of the things that he mentioned, the annual governance statement, and it is an area that we're now tying into the annual governance statement as well, where we're reporting through the medium of the annual governance statement. We report to the Accounts and Audit Committee as well around the probity of those separate organisations. So this is really to ensure that we have correctly identified all the bodies that we currently have established, and to ensure that there is a line of governance and accounting and responsibility in respect of all those bodies. And so we have a picture that can be publicly available, so that there is absolute clarity around all those organisations. I mean, obviously there is an element of that in any way, because most of these are incorporated organisations, so they are registered companies registry, and there are rules that apply. But this is so that we will make the information more publicly available and easily available. So again, when we set this out, we thought it might be a little bit more complicated than it is. We think there are probably less organisations that we need to report on, but this does provide for us to be able to come back to you with details of what those bodies are, what their current reporting requirements are, and lines of authority, terms of reference, to make sure that they apply with the Nolan principles, and then you can ensure that you're satisfied in that respect.
Just a quick question. Thank you, Chair. Would we automatically, when we're going into partnership with these organisations, would we ask them to sign up to the Nolan principles as a matter of course? Or could we?
We would govern that in things like, so for example, if we've entered into a joint venture, we'll have a partnership agreement, and it will set out that they must comply with all those things. So, and there'll be things around anti-corruption, there'll be all the things to ensure that they meet all the normal statutory requirements that we have to, and the duties that we're subject to. So,
okay. Sorry, can I just come back with the secondary? It's on the same theme. Responsible officers stroke team that you've got down, that it's a working group. Do we know what that working group, or whom that would involve?
This goes back to it. We thought it'd be more complicated, so it may take a few officers, but it'd probably be myself and one officer from partnerships, just to make sure that we cover everything.
Forgive me, in my ignorance of the Nolan principles, to say that if there is a partnership, presumably they're governed by normal commercial complaints procedures, is it implicit then that this document sets out that there is that dividing line, that any complaints against those doesn't come back through this group?
So complaints could only come through this, well, should only come through this group on the basis that they relate to members, and so members' involvement with those groups, and that's one of those very strange areas, because a member of the council who is then a director, or is on a board of a trust or something, it would generally, in those circumstances, have to act in the best interests of the company, because they'll have in those circumstances they'll have a duty to the company in their role as a director. So you have these issues of conflict. But that should not impinge on the issues around openness, because again they'll need to declare interests in respect of both bodies, and I'm not quite sure.
No, I suppose I'm just thinking to try and be explicit about where that line is drawn between what this group has responsibility for and that which has other commercial laws responsibility. And I think, as you just described it, I think that is going to be quite a difficult line to tread if there is a dual role of a member, with a guiding principle towards the corporation and a guiding principle towards the council. So how would that be determined, where that person sits if there was a complaint?
No, I mean, I think that's something we will need to consider, but because obviously the first thing that we will always consider in relation to any complaint is whether the member complained against is acting in their capacity as a member at that time. And they may well not, because they're acting as a director, they may well not be acting as a member at that point. So I'm talking myself into some more problems, I think.
It feels a little bit that to me, in the sense I'm trying to sort of picture how that member will not always be acting as a member, official body.
There's a partnership there, but if they're acting as a director on that board, at that point they will be required to be acting in the best interests of that body itself, rather than in the best interests of the council necessarily. They would have to consider whether there was any conflict at that point between their role as a member and their role as a director. So there are issues there, and it would need necessary, and there is some quite detailed guidance that is available to members in terms of how they fulfill, if they're in a position where they have dual roles, how they fulfill that. But it is quite a balance. But they would generally, if they're acting as a director, they'd be judged on those bases in the first instance, generally.
Councillor Dr. Carr.
Although equally, they are, and I think this is probably the point. Maybe they are always an elected member, so they do have to be subject to scrutiny in all roles that they carry out. So if they have done something that could be held to be in any way negative towards council business, then regardless of whether that was in another role, they really have to still, be open to investigation or scrutiny of that action. I would have said.
Yeah, just as a follow on to that, I presume there's nothing to stop somebody being the subject of more than one complaints process. So in that sort of scenario, a member might come to this committee. Let's say the partnership had traded fraudulently or something. We would still want to complain that to come to this committee, but the member as a director of that company as well would face consequences for that. They might be criminal, or they might be complaints about the way the company conducted their affairs. So I think Dr. Carr's right in that we would still want to consider those complaints if it relates to their role as a member, I suppose, and if they occupy that position by virtue of being a member and by virtue of council business, however that's transacted, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that there are two things there. So I think what I'm thinking about is in terms of the question of conflict and the terms of what they're guided by when they're acting for when they're a director of a company, and where their first duty lies. So I'm assuming that these people are all acting properly, and I'm not assuming that they're acting wrongly. I think you're right. If they have been guilty of bad behaviour of some sort, then we would have to look at the possibility of them being caught by one or both codes at that point. So I think it's more around the technical thing around where their interests lie in the first instance. But it's a very complicated area.
I suppose I'm just trying to sort of tease out in my own mind. I'm a little concerned about the potential double jeopardy there in the sense of two complaints procedures. And I'm thinking more that if there were a criminal act within the partnership, for instance, you would normally anticipate that the criminal law would take precedence in the first instance. And I wonder, is there some sort of hierarchy here that, for instance, I don't know whether it should, but corporate law should take a higher priority, for instance, than this group? I don't know, but I think these are the sorts of things that need teasing out from it.
But I think the thing is, I think that what this particular item is getting at, though, is not so much around complaints against individuals. It's getting at the openness of the body itself. So what it's trying to get to is a position whereby anything which the council has an interest in is subject to the same principles of openness. So at the moment, if we have a board meeting for one of our companies, there's no obligation for us to publish, other than through the normal sort of company processes, anything to do with minutes, agendas, or what have you. What this is that those bodies go through into a much more open arena. So I think we've probably gone off at a tangent in that this actual item of best practice is not aimed at members' conduct when they're sitting on those bodies. It's aimed about getting those bodies to be more open and transparent. So that they will have to publish agendas, will have to publish minutes. Does that help? The final one, and that's around senior officers to meet regularly with political group leaders or group whips to discuss standards issues. I mean, it is something that we do informally, and we now have political assistants in the council, so we try and meet with those as well. We're trying to sort of bringing a protocol around how we work with the political assistants, for example, which again will help with openness and transparency there. But the recommendation here is that we actually programme in quarterly meetings with the group leaders so that we have a forum in which we can regularly raise standards issues so that it is more in the forefront of their minds as well.
Okay, we've had a good discussion there. Is there any other points that anyone would like to raise? Okay, so can we agree the action plan?
Subject to the amendment.
Yeah.
Trying to bring forward some of it quicker.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to the next agenda point, which is the monitoring officer's report.
And you be pleased to say that I don't have much to add after all of that. Again, it's just a brief update. We've had no new complaints since the last meeting, which is good news. In terms of training, we have got the first, we looked at areas which we thought would be useful for training, and there is a training session now on the 17th of February, which is on is to help members in terms of personal safety and complaints and such like. So that is, we've got external providers coming in to provide training session for members on that. I've been working with the workforce development team with Nina and that does the training for members more generally, and we're working up a programme which will have further training throughout the coming municipal year, which again I'll bring it to you so that you'll see the areas that we're picking up on for training and have the opportunity to comment on that as well. Okay, and I don't think I have anything else to add. We've had another election since we last met. I'm pleased to say that I think generally behaviour was we didn't get that many complaints about behaviour on this occasion. I think it was, despite the fact that it was quite an emotional affair, I think, at times. And I think the only other thing is I will just remind you all that we're going to be going through a boundary. We've got local government boundary commission coming in to do a review, and there is a meeting with them before the council meeting on the next week. If there are any changes that are required, then they will come through this committee as well. So,
yeah, thank you. I'm not sure that's correct actually, because we've been invited to go to the over the road to have a look at the Kellogg site. So I think the boundary commission's been delayed.
sorry, I'll double check. I know they'd originally wanted to come in before the next council meeting, but they may well be that it's the one subsequent that they're coming in before. They're coming in.
Okay, well, unless anyone's got anything else to add, I'll move on to the final agenda item, which is urgent business. Do we have any urgent business? No. Okay, well, we can close the meeting at this point then. Thank you very much. Thank you.